Hey everybody, welcome to our inaugural Fully Involved podcast here with the Lakeville Fire Department. We're going to use this opportunity to kind of introduce you guys to some topics that we think are interesting and worthwhile from a training perspective, especially considering we can't meet in a practical setting as much as we used to with all the stuff going on in the world right now. So our first podcast we're going to cover is the new UL FSRI study, the analysis of the coordination of suppression and ventilation in single-family homes. This study came out on March 19th, so a few weeks ago now, and it kind of got lost in the shuffle with all of the stuff that's been going on as far as the COVID-19 and everything. It kind of got put by the wayside, which is a shame because it actually has a lot of really good information in it. This report was over 400 pages long. And like a lot of UL studies, it is not exactly a page turner. There's a lot of technical jargon with it, a lot of reading between the lines. So we figured that we'd go through this and break it down as far as how it affects our operations and some of the practical implications of it. So anytime that you have a study of this magnitude, they always kind of start off with the purpose of the study. So the purpose of this particular study was to improve the knowledge of fire dynamics and the impact of fire suppression tactics and define the coordination of ventilation and suppression. This is something that gets cited a lot when we talk about underlying causes of firefighter line of duty injuries and deaths. A lot of times you'll be reading like a NIOSH report and they'll say, well, we recommend that ventilation be closely coordinated with fire attack, but they don't really define what that actually is. So this study kind of set forth as an endeavor to try to define that a little bit better. Like, what is a coordination between ventilation and suppression? Do you ventilate just before suppression operations begin? Do you do it during? Do you do it a little bit after? Does it really make a difference? Either way. So this they kind of did a bunch of experiments to try to figure out, what is the best method and try to define this a little bit better, or even come up with an answer as to whether you can define it or not. And this is actually one of the first of a series of studies that they're going to do. This one covered residential fires from an interior fire suppression standpoint, or what we consider an interior fire suppression standpoint. They're going to be doing some more that may cover larger buildings, commercial structures. That's going to be coming a little bit down the road. So how did they conduct the study? So they did a series of 20 experiments with 8 different structures. They were all wood frame residential homes. They simulated 2 different scenarios. One was a second floor bedroom fire, and one was a first floor kitchen fire. And they utilized 6 different suppression methods to try to figure out if there was a better option as far as a combination of suppression and ventilation. And this photo to the right is actually a still image from one of the experiments they did. So you can see that this was not a small fire. This wasn't just like a little training burn. They actually did go to quite an extensive level as far as trying to simulate a real post-flashover type of structural fire. So the suppression methods that were used in this study, they split them between the second floor and first floor fires. So on the second floor bedroom fire, they used 4 different methods. The first 2 were both interior fire suppression. They had one that was ventilation post-fire control and one that was ventilation prior to fire control. And then they had 2 different exterior fire control, what we consider to be a transitional attack type scenarios. One was they ventilated post-initial water flow, and the other one was actually a simulation of a ceiling failure. So in other words, they were trying to do a transitional attack onto a second floor fire where the ceiling was not intact. So there was no additional ventilation done on that scenario. And then on the first floor kitchen fire, they had an interior suppression with ventilation prior to fire control, and then they had exterior fire control or transitional attack with ventilation post initial water flow. So they started flowing water from the outside, then did a ventilation maneuver, and then went inside and completed extinguishment. Those were the 6 different suppression methods that they used in this study. And this just shows the fuels that we utilized in the studies there. So on the left, you have the fuel package for the bedroom fire, and then on the right, you have the fuel package for the kitchen fires. These were not fires that were set up with straw and pallets. This was actual furnishings that you would actually find inside an average home in America. They used real furniture, real furnishings. This was an actual, like a real life fire load that you would actually see out in the field. So it really gave you a really realistic scenario as far as when they started to lay this off. This behaved just like a real structure fire would. This was not just a training burn. This was an actual scientific experiment that they did with this.
At the conclusion of the scenario, the analysis of the data showed that there was no meaningful increase in the temperature outside the fire room, and that was when vent tactics were in coordination with the onset of suppression, so either before or after. Another thing that they found was after effective suppression had begun, vent tactics should consider airflow within the structure with the aim of establishing airflow through the areas where occupants may be located. And when you think of ventilation, which is the systematic removal of heat, smoke, and fire gases from a structure, if you know you have occupants in there, that's going to make the visibility a lot better and improve the viability conditions. So in many scenarios, the most effective means to accomplish this may be in coordinated horizontal ventilation of as many windows as necessary. And in all the studies that they used, less than 250 gallons was used during the initial suppression period, and less than 500 gallons was used in total for each of the 20 room and content fire experiments. They also found that regrowth was observed during the 1 minute delay following exterior suppression in the second floor bedroom fires. And on the contrary, regrowth was not observed in the 1 minute delay following exterior suppression on the first floor kitchen fire, where more complete wetting of the room and content was possible. They found that opening the front door is ventilation. Even in experiments where the fire room windows were in the front door, where the only sources of ventilation, fire growth was observed because of the more efficient flow path created as a result of the front door ventilation. Additionally, the air entrained through the open front door improved conditions for potential occupants located in the flow path. So this picture might be a little familiar to some of our folks. When you consider vent tactics, is ventilation important on the fire ground? The study concluded, yes, certainly it is. So coordinated ventilation actions occur when the temperature and toxic gases levels return to normal in the structure far sooner than only if suppression actions are done. Study concluded the following ventilation tactics. They looked at vertical ventilation, horizontal ventilation, your quick PPV, and hydraulic ventilation. So which methods work? The simple answer is all of them. It just depends on the situation. You could potentially use all of them in one building, all at different times.
Right, so breaking down the individual ventilation tactics that they looked at in this study, they considered vertical ventilation in several of the experiments. So we kind of already know what vertical ventilation does as far as being able to help us out. It does improve visibility and tenability in the flow path of where you're moving in between the inlet and the outlet of the fire. Vertical ventilation does improve that. That was shown in the study. It could, however, potentially cause increase in temperature in the fire compartment because you are adding an additional pathway for fresh air to enter the building. The study found that when vertical ventilation is done simultaneously with fire suppression, you do get improved conditions for the engine crew, and they are able to put the fire out before any negative effects happen. So if you can vertical vent simultaneously with the engine crew making the push towards the fire, you will improve conditions for them for their advancement, and they will be able to get to that fire compartment, put the fire out before you get any negative effects as far as increasing the heat or growth rate of the fire. That's kind of what the study found. But it has to be done in close coordination with the suppression crew. They did do some experiments as far as placement of the vent hole. They experimented with placing the vent hole directly above the fire versus over the outside hallway. When we place the vent hole directly above the fire, you get increase in temperatures in the fire room because you're creating a pathway for fresh air to get into that fire compartment. But the conditions get better outside the fire room. So they get better in the area of the flow path where you're working. If you put the vent hole outside the hallway, you get a decreased temperature in the fire room because the hot gases are being vented away from the compartment. But this may make things worse in the hallway because the fire is going to be drawn to the vent hole. So this, the image to the right is actually a still picture from one of the firefighters' helmet cams as they're advancing up the stairs with the vertical vent above them in the hallway. So you can actually see the flames are actually coming out of the fire compartment, out of the fire room into the hallway. So they're actually the fire crew is actually getting beat up a little bit here. They're getting increased temperatures and products of combustion coming towards them as the fire vents towards the vent hole in the hallway. Again, they were prepared for this, so there was no negative consequences to this because they were able to open the line up and flow water as they were advancing in, and they put the fire out, and it was fine. But you can see how if you didn't have that coordinated and that suppression crew wasn't prepared for that to happen, you can see how that could potentially be an issue for you there. So the bottom line for vertical ventilation for us is a good tactic for second floor fires if there are enough resources to vent the roof simultaneously with fire attack. If you can get a crew to the roof in the proper place while that suppression crew is making their push towards the seat of the fire, it can work. It's probably safest for the interior crew if you vent directly above the fire versus the hallway. You keep the ventilation action happening inside the fire compartment and not interfering with the push towards the fire. If you vertical vent too soon before the suppression crew is actually actively making that push towards where the fire compartment is, you're going to make the fire worse because you're going to cause increased temperature and increased growth rate for the fire. If you vertical vent too late, after the suppression action has already happened, there really isn't enough benefit. At that point, you just kind of cutting a hole in the roof for no real gain to the situation. So really, vertical vents is a good option for a second floor fire, but it has to be done kind of in that sweet spot there. If you do it too soon, it's going to be a major problem. If you do it too late, you're not really getting enough benefit out of it for the additional property damage that you're incurring, plus the additional risk and manpower strain of putting people up on the roof too. So it has to be done kind of in that sweet spot there if you have the manpower. If you do, great. If not, there are other options that you can use that will be effective as well.
So in regard to horizontal ventilation, the study concluded that it consisted of opening additional windows either simultaneously with or after fire suppression in the fire compartment. Horizontal ventilation, its best overall results for improving the tenability throughout the structure. And you need to be mindful of creating additional flow paths. So the bottom line, once water is on the fire, other crews are in the building should consider opening the windows to vent the smoke and all those products of combustion.
And in the study, Pam, one of the things that they recommended was fire departments adopting some type of a radio communication language for that, so that the suppression crew, once they get to that fire compartment and they're putting water on the seat of the fire, to declare over the radio water on the fire. And that would kind of be like a trigger for there's maybe search and rescue crews that are operating in the building while they're doing their search pattern, start opening up windows inside the building and letting some fresh air in. That's going to help improve visibility and also reduce the exposure to any toxic gases for any people that might be trapped in the building remote from the fire. So that was one of the things that they had discussed there with that, is like coming up with some type of a standardized radio terminology to declare that you have water on the fire and it's safe to actually start opening those windows horizontally.
And that just shows you in that instance that the ventilation needs to be in coordination with suppression, and it goes to show you that you do have to have good coordination and communication.
Exactly, and this here just shows one of the experiments that they did where they have the flow paths actually marked out of how the air actually moves inside the building when they take various actions. One of the things that that you'll note here is that you have a certain flow path going through the building prior to the front door being opened. Then once you open the front door, you can see how it creates a change in that pattern, right? You start actually getting an increase in ventilation and exhaust of hot gas out of the building when that front door gets open. And then when you open the windows after this actually occurred just after the fire water started going onto the fire, you open up another flow path here, right? Which we don't want that to happen if this area here is not under control, right? But once we start putting water on this fire, we start opening this up. This allows another pathway for those hot gases and toxic, bad stuff that we don't want people breathing in to get out of the building, and it helps promote that ventilation.
So in regard to hydraulic ventilation, you might remember back to your old recruit days. Hydraulic ventilation is a good tool in the toolbox. It does have some limitations. What it does is it basically is used post-suppression as a tactic. It works well by removing the heat products of combustion from the fire room. It doesn't work well at remote areas. Bottom line, it's a good idea, but we need to do other stuff too. The hydraulic ventilation, it's an effective tactic, and you want to basically vent small compartmentalized spaces. It's a quick off and on. Positive pressure ventilation, the study experimented with PPV used simultaneously with and after fire control. Using the PPV during the fire attack also requires controlled inlet and outlet, and something not considered in the study, which might have been helpful, the effect of PPV on hidden fire like void spaces in balloon frame construction. Bottom line here with PPV, for us, stay away from PPV. You're basically best off to do that after extinguishment.
One of the things that always kind of sticks in my head when it comes to using positive pressure for fire attack, if we go back to 2003, you go back to the fire in Lancaster that killed Martin McNamara. That was an example of a crew where they thought they had the fire out. They were doing overhaul operations. The fire was still suspended in a void space with a drop ceiling in the attic. It was an old balloon frame house. They set up the PPV fan at the door, and that introduction of large amounts of fresh air fed the fire, and it caused basically a conflagration of the fire inside that drop ceiling, which then trapped a couple of firefighters down in the basement, and Martin McNamara ended up passing away for that. So that's a good case study to look up there. But it's one of those things where a lot of departments do utilize this tactic successfully, and it can work. And the studies show that it can actually work and be beneficial. But there's a lot of risk with it if you are in a situation where you don't know that you have the fire completely in hand. If you have a fire that's in hidden spaces, that's in walls, in drop ceilings, you can cause a lot of problems with this. So I'm not a big fan of positive pressure attack in this region of the country with the construction and everything that we have. But that PPV fan be useful after extinguishment, helping clear smoke and products combustion out of the building after you get everything under control? Yeah, it sure can, and we can definitely use it for that. But I would tend to stay away from utilizing it in conjunction with the actual suppression action. And then when we go through door ventilation here, right, this is really important for us to consider, right? The acting of opening the door to access the structure is a ventilation action. Every single experiment that they did in this study proves that. And it has a number of positive and negative effects on the fire environment. When you open the door, it's going to bring fresh air into the building. That's going to reduce the amount of toxic insult and heat insult that the victims are receiving at that particular point in time. It's also going to improve visibility because it's going to lift some of that smoke off of the lower portion of the compartment. It's going to raise that neutral plane up, right? But it also feeds fresh air to the fire as well. When you open the door, you're going to see an increase in temperature inside the fire compartment. You're going to see an increase in growth of the fire. We know, and we've known for a while now, that fires that are in a closed compartment are very likely to be ventilation limited by the time that we arrive. So when we arrive to a house that is more or less closed up, that fire is not going to be fuel limited. That fire is going to be ventilation limited. So every time that we introduce fresh air into that fire environment, it's going to have a negative effect as far as fire growth, right? So once we open the door, the clock is ticking on this fire. So we can't screw around with this. We have to get to where the fire is right away, because the longer we operate in that building with the door open and with no water on the fire, the worse that fire is going to get for us. They did do an experiment using door control actions after the hose line went in, and they found that really had no real effect on the fire at all when they did that. It was basically what they did in the experiment was they had the suppression crew go in, and then of course once you put the hose in, you can't really close the door on until you've made your way to where the fire actually is, right? So what they did was they had the crew go in, get to where the fire was through radio communication with a door control person. That person then shut the door to just basically enough so that the hose line would go in. So they basically closed the door on the hose line to try to limit the amount of ventilation that was going on, and it had no appreciable effect on the fire. Nothing happened with the fire until they actually put water on it. So the idea of assigning somebody just to sit there and control the door while the hose line is moving in is really not beneficial, at least as far as the study was concerned. Now, there's other techniques that you can look at that the European Fire Service is using, and you're starting to see it pop up a little bit here as far as utilizing like smoke curtains to kind of block the door without actually having to use the door to close that compartment off. And this study didn't really consider that, and it's probably worth a little bit more research to see if that would have any sort of effect. But in general, in the scenarios that we're going to be facing, having somebody, you're taking somebody off of another task to try to control the door after the line goes in is probably not a hugely worthwhile thing.
So considerations of fire suppression. One of the things made very clear in this study, the initial engine operations are the single most important component of a successful operation. So the first due engine has a very big onus on their back. If we put the fire out, everything gets better. And that goes with pretty much every type of fire, but in here we're looking at the residential structures. If we coordinate the fire suppression and ventilation, it gets better faster. Our default mode on these fires should be interior fire attack. So get in and overwhelm the fire with the proper fire stream, straight or solid stream, 150 gallons per minute minimum.
So going to some further considerations for fire suppression, one thing that they found in the study that really kind of confirmed a lot of what we already knew looking back at the evidence, hallway control is very important in a post-flashover environment. So we're talking about a fire that was in a compartment that reached flashover, is now in the fully developed stage, and is now beginning to extend out of that initial fire room, right? Or maybe it may even involve 2 rooms at this point, right? So when you have a fire that's that intense and you're making an interior fire attack, making the scene of the fire is going to be very difficult for you unless you open up and flow water in that hallway as you're advancing, because the heat is going to be very, very difficult on you. It's going to be driving you to the ground. You got to open that line up and start cooling that environment down, okay? So in the experiments that they did, they looked at the tactics of hit and move versus flow and move. And if you're not familiar with that terminology, hit and move would be you're advancing in the hallway towards the fire, you encounter heat, you stop, set yourself, send a burst of water ahead of you into the ceiling, try to get some of the walls wet, right? Maybe do a little O pattern. Then you shut down, and then you continue to move forward. Flow and move, you open the line up, and then you continuously flow water until you get to the scene of the fire, right? There's no stopping in between. You open that line up, and then once you stop flowing water, you don't stop. You utilize some type of a pattern selection, whether it be an O pattern, which is kind of the simplest way to do it, or you could use like what Ray McCormack calls an N pattern or an inverted U pattern while you're sweeping the floor, whatever you decide to pick, but you're constantly flowing water as you move forward and advance onto the fire. So when it comes to determining which one of those is better, you have to understand the concept of regrowth and the effects that has on the fire environment. When you do a hit and move, right? And most of us have probably done a hit and move at some point during an interior fire attack. And in the old days when we were utilizing high pressure nozzles and, lightweight hose, a lot of times we kind of had to use hit and move because the attack package that we had didn't support anything else. When you hit and move, you have positive effects, but those effects only last for as long as the nozzle is open. Once I close that nozzle and I start moving forward again, that heat is going to come right back because, again, we're not putting water on the fire. We're not suppressing the fire at this point. We're just trying to control the heat that's in our path of advancement. So once I shut that nozzle down, that heat is going to come right back on me. So what you end up doing in a hit and move situation is you open up, you flow water, you shut down, you move forward, the heat comes back, you have the reset, send another burst of water out, shut down, move forward, reset, another burst of water, and then continue moving forward. So it's slowing you down because you have to stop and continually do that hit and move action, right? If I do a flow and move, and I open that nozzle up and I don't stop until I get to where the fire is, that keeps the heat suppressed until I reach the fire compartment. It allows me to move much, much faster. It may use a little bit more water. The study shows that it's very minuscule, the difference between the hit and move and flow and move. But the actual action is much more effective because it allows you to get to the fire faster because you're not having to continuously stop and reset. Doesn't mean the hit and move doesn't work. That they showed in the study that it does actually work really well, but flow and move is generally better because it keeps that heat suppressed and it allows you to move through that hallway faster to get to where the seat of the fire is. And the most effective nozzle technique that you're going to use is one that's going to coat the most surface area in fuel. This is really an important concept to understand too, because as you're advancing to the fire, right, we don't have to worry about just the hot gas layer and also that smoke layer, right? We know that smoke is just unburned products of combustion, right, that could light off at any time if it gets hot enough. But when we think about the kind of geometry of the hallway, you think about the ceiling and the walls, those structures trap heat, right? Which is going to make our advancement more difficult as we move forward. If I coat that entire area, that entire hallway with water, it reduces the ability for those structures to retain heat. And those effects will last throughout the entire advancement process of getting that hose line to where the seat of the fire is. So again, flow and move, utilizing a simple pattern of movement, such as an O pattern, is really, really effective in getting yourself to where the fire is and to be able to suppress it effectively. So this is kind of actually a cutaway of a hallway that they actually included in the study. And I always think that this is funny when we start talking about geometry and like these scientific terms of these studies, because I remember going into the fire academy over a decade ago now, and I remember Kenny Lima from Fall River Fire, in the burn building with us and talking to us about, kid, yeah, you gotta utilize geometry. You gotta use geometry to your advantage with these streams, right? And these are guys that were fighting fires in the 70s and 80s. And they understood these concepts. It wasn't, backed by any sort of like scientific experiment. It was just based off of experience that they had just on the job and knowing what worked. And we kind of got away from it for some reason. And in reality, all this scientific stuff that we're doing now is proving that the way they fought fires back in those days was proper. It was right. It worked. So this kind of shows how you can utilize geometry to your advantage when you're advancing down a hallway and you have a fire in a room that is offset from your path of travel. So in this scenario here, you're advancing down the hallway and the fire room is basically to your left. This is where the actual fire room is. And you're getting hit with heat and products of combustion that are coming out of this fire room because it's in a post-flashover state, right? So in this scenario, they're showing you how you can utilize the door frame or the king post to your advantage and actually do what I would call a bank shot, basically, to get water into that fire compartment as you're advancing. So the way that you can kind of explain this would be a good tactic in a situation like this is you're advancing towards the hallway, right? You're getting a lot of heat and smoke and whatnot coming at you. Maybe you might even see a little bit of rollover starting to happen, right? If I take my stream at the beginning of this hallway, right, and I slice the ceiling with my stream, so I start away from me and I open up and I bring the stream back, right? What that's going to do is that's going to start to cool down that hot gas layer, and my stream is going to break up when it hits the ceiling, and it's going to kind of run along the ceiling and act almost like a sprinkler head. Okay, so I'm getting the ceiling wet, right? And I'm also getting at least a portion of these walls wet too, which reduces their ability to hold in heat. Okay, then as I advance forward, I'm going to bring my stream into, we'll say, an O pattern. Okay, let's see if I can find it here. Yep. So I'll bring my stream into, say, we'll say like an O pattern. So I'm going to try to start to coat this area with as much water as I can, right? And then as I advance forward, I can then drop my stream down, and I can try to bank shot that stream off of that king post or off of that door frame, and try to see if I can break that stream up, and I can actually start getting water into that fire compartment even before I actually reach the point where I can actually turn that nozzle into the doorway, right? The best way to do that would be is if I took my hose line, and instead of trying to bring it down the middle of the hallway, I want to try to hug this opposite wall here, okay? So I start to try to hug that opposite wall, and then I can advance the hose line on that. So that way, when I get to a certain point, once I've got all this out of the way, I can actually bring that stream down and right into that room. And in the experiment, they utilized a combination nozzle on a straight stream. I think anecdotally, a smooth bore would probably work even better in this environment, because now when I take that slug of water and I bounce it off of that king post, that door frame there, it's going to break up into much larger droplets of water versus a combination nozzle set to a straight stream, and you're probably going to get a lot more volume of those droplets into that room in that sort of like a indirect type attack. So second floor fires. Continuing on, the experiments show it's very important to begin your suppression operations from the staircase in a post-flashover environment. Because if you think about this, right, you're starting on a staircase trying to move up to the second floor. You're basically moving up into the heated environment, right? That's going to be very difficult to do when you have an intense fire. So you want to start flowing up the stairs, and again, use that geometry to your advantage, okay? This is another still from a helmet cam of one of the experiments that they did, and you can see that this is a pretty intense fire. This is obviously reached flashover. It's in the fully developed state right now, right? And it's actually kind of ventilated out of the fire compartment. Is actually called the banister on fire, and the fire room is right here, right? So, and if you think about like a typical colonial staircase, right? Your staircase is gonna go like an L, right? So you're gonna go up, and there's gonna be like a little landing, right? And then you're gonna kind of advance like this, right? Kind of like in that direction, okay? So what you can do in this situation is you can start flowing water actually from the bottom of the staircase, okay? You can probably hit that banister, right? And then as you're advancing up, you're going to direct your stream up, and you're going to hit that hot gas layer and start to cool ahead of yourself as you're advancing up the stairs. And then once you turn that corner, you're going to be able to bring that nozzle across your body, and you're actually going to be able to start hitting that fire room as soon as it comes into range. So as soon as you reach the part of the staircase where you can actually see where that fire room is, you can actually bring that nozzle across your body and actually start hitting that fire room even before you make the top of the staircase. It's really important to understand. This is why nozzle mechanics are really important. You cannot do that if you have the nozzle in your armpit. You have got to have that hose out in front of you, at least an arm's length away, right? So that way you have enough hose in front of you to be able to direct it across this entire range of what we're talking about here, right? And you can't do that if you don't have proper mechanics. That's why we really emphasize proper nozzle mechanics with you guys, not holding onto the pistol grip, not having that nozzle in your armpit. You've got to get it out in front of yourself So that way you have the ability to get this complete range of what we're trying to hit here, right? That's going to make the difference between you being pushed back down the staircase and you being able to advance forward and put this fire out. So talking about exterior fire attack, but transitional fire attack, right? This is always a fun thing to talk about because everybody has different opinions on what to do or how to do this, right? So they considered a lot of this inside in the UL study, right? And, does it work? Does exterior fire attack or transitional fire attack actually work? The short answer is yes. Okay, and we've known for a while that yes, it does work. Is it the best tactic? And the answer to that question is not always. It's a tool in the toolbox. It's not necessarily something that you always should do, nor is it always an appropriate tactic for every situation. And one of the things that they found in this study, which I thought was interesting, was the results are very different on first floor fires versus second floor fires. So when we talk about transitional attacks on the first floor, the study found that exterior water application through the window on a first floor fire works very well if you have access to a window that is at the fire compartment. So in other words, if the fire is in the kitchen, you have access to a kitchen window where you can actually hit the fire compartment. Same thing with if the fire was in the living room. If you had access to a particular window inside that living room, you can utilize this tactic. If the fire is in the kitchen and the closest window that you can get is the living room, it's not going to really work. But the reason why exterior water application through the window works so well on a first floor fire is because you have a greater ability to cover more of the compartment with water, because you have the ability not only just to do an indirect application, but you can actually stick that nozzle through the window and actually directly hit the burning fuel, the burning material inside that compartment, right? So when we do this, we're going to start with a ceiling hit, just as previously taught. So you're going to get up under the window, basically, and you're going to hit the top of the ceiling, trying to get that water to kind of glide across the ceiling to try to hit that hot gas layer, right? Once we do that, if your visibility inside the compartment is good, in other words, you can see what you're aiming at, bring that stream down, that straight or solid stream down, and start hitting the burning fuel. If the couch is burning, hit the couch. If the kitchen table is burning, hit the kitchen table. Stop doing a direct attack on the burning fuel through the window. If the visibility is poor, one of the things that they recommend is that to take that combination nozzle and put it either to a 30-degree fog, or if you have a smooth bore, half bail it to create a broken stream. And that will actually cover a lot of the compartment, even if you can't see exactly what you're aiming at. Important note, you have to make sure the nozzle goes inside the window when you are doing this. So you're not hitting this fire from outside anymore, technically. You're actually going to stick that nozzle inside the window. That's going to limit the amount of air entrainment that you actually bring into the building. Because if you use a fog or a half bail from outside the window, you're going to entrain a lot of fresh air into that compartment, which we don't want. So you want to make sure that nozzle actually goes inside the window while you're making that direct attack onto the fuel. And then you're going to transition to the interior as soon as you're able. And one of the criticisms of this tactic, or one of the concerns about this tactic, is in the amount of time it takes you to move that hose line from the outside to the inside, is that fire going to experience a regrowth? And the experiments showed that on a first floor fire, it is very unlikely that that's going to experience regrowth in the time it takes you to move from outside to inside, because you have that ability of doing a direct attack through the window. So this is definitely an applicable tactic in a lot of situations if you have direct access to the fire compartment through a window, and if you're in a situation where you might not be able to start an interior attack right away. If you're on a two-person engine, maybe you have to wait for the driver to mask up before you can make an attack inside. Can you hit the fire through the window while he's doing that? Absolutely. If you're in a situation where maybe you're trying to force entry and somebody has something really bizarre, blocking the doorway, and you're having a hard time, can I hit this through the window and put the fire out? Absolutely, right? Then we can go inside and finish our attack. It definitely is a tactic that should be in your toolbox. The second floor results, I think, were really interesting. They found that this transitional attack doesn't really work as well on the second floor as it does versus the first floor. And the reason behind that is because you have a reduced ability to wet down fuel on a second floor fire from the exterior, because you don't have the ability to stick the nozzle through the window and start hitting burning material on the second floor. Obviously, I can't be on the ground and bring my arms up 15 feet to try to hit the fire through the window, right? The only thing I can do is indirect water application. And the traditional method of doing a transitional fire attack was highly dependent on the ceiling being intact, because you're trying again to get up under that window and hit that ceiling at a steep angle so that the water rises across the ceiling, right? That's kind of what we're trying to do. Well, if there's no ceiling there, we can't really do that, right? And that was one of the things that they looked at in this study is how well does this work if the ceiling isn't there? We can overcome some of the issues by using what they call a lintel hit method. So instead of just trying to hit at a high angle at the ceiling, if you bring that stream back a little bit and you hit the lintel above the window, it will kind of change the angle of that stream a little bit and get it more into the room so that you start actually hitting a little bit more in the middle of the room in the burning fuel. They found that was a lot more effective versus just doing the ceiling hit. But one of the things that they found with the second floor transitional is that the positive effects only last for as long as the nozzle is open. Once you close the nozzle and you stop flowing water into that compartment from the outside, the fire is going to return back to its free burning state. Regrowth is very likely while moving from the outside to the inside. And in every experiment they did with this, in the amount of time it took them to move that line from the outside to the inside, by the time they hit the fire room, the temperatures had increased to basically the same as they had been prior to the exterior water application. Okay, so as a company officer or somebody that's thinking about whether to apply this tactic, you really have to question whether this is even worthwhile versus getting inside right away. In the great majority of the cases, the answer is going to be no. Okay, it's not saying that that's always going to be the case. If you're in a situation where you show up to one of these fires by yourself, and the fire's on the second floor and you have access to the window, can you hit that? Sure, yeah, you can, and it may at least keep the fire in check. While you're waiting for more manpower to get there, or like I said, maybe you have a really weird forcible entry scenario. Can I start applying water in there and then hopefully keep the fire at least from spreading while we're doing that? Sure. But outside of those, relatively rare circumstances, you're going to be better off on a second floor fire to just get in the building and put water on the fire from the inside as fast as you can, because you're not very likely to see a improvement in your ability to get inside with the transitional hit, because it's going to be back into its regular state by the time that you get up the stairs.
And Ryan, just before we go to the next slide, I was just going to admonish, I know how this is a popular tactic now, but you can't go into this situation with a predetermined idea that this is what I'm going to use. It's a good tool in the toolbox, but it needs to be used appropriately.
Right, and that's all going to depend on our size up, right? The most critical thing that you can do as a company officer or as a as an acting company officer is actually making that 360 and determining what our most appropriate tactic is going to be based on that size up, right? You cannot select a tactic while you're driving down the road going to a fire, right? You cannot have a predetermined method for how you're going to attack a fire. It's all situation dependent, and you have to be able to understand multiple different ways of going about fixing a problem, right? And again, this is one tool that's in the toolbox. Whether it's applicable or not is going to depend on the situation. But just understand that in the great majority of the times, if you're talking about a first floor fire, there's a possibility that this may be useful. Second floor fire, your options are much more limited with this because of the fact that it's just not as effective trying to lob water through a second floor window versus a first floor window. And like I said, you really have to understand regrowth effects and how fire streams and water mapping actually work as well to make the most effect out of this. So this slide is a couple of other images from the study, and it kind of just shows how the fire streams kind of operate here, right? So to the left, you see kind of the traditional ceiling hit, right? So in this situation, what you're doing here is you're actually you're trying to aim at the ceiling and trying to get that water to ride across the ceiling, right? So that works, that helps take out that hot gas layer, right? But you have a big area here that is not getting water, right? Because the stream does not come down at the same angle it goes up. So you're missing like a good portion in the middle of the room here as far as being able to get this room wet, right? And that's just because you can't directly get water onto that area. You're relying solely on geometry trying to carry that water, right? And then if you look to this other image here, this experiment 14, this was the experiment where they actually they simulated a ceiling failure where they're shooting water into the second floor window trying to hit the ceiling, and there's no ceiling there. So in this situation, the water is all going into the attic. It's not even having any effect on the fire compartment at all. So that's even going to be even worse for you when you try to do it in that situation. So what they found was that in this modified tactic they use called the lintel hit, if you start off aiming that screen towards the ceiling, and then you bring it back a little bit so that you're actually hitting that top of the window, that lintel there, it drops the angle of that stream down so that you actually are getting some water into the middle portion of that compartment, which is going to be a lot more effective versus just trying to hit the ceiling. So that was something that they found was a useful modification to that tactic, is just bringing the stream up a little bit, bringing the nozzle back towards you a little bit so that you're hitting the lintel instead of just the ceiling.
Now, I found this study pretty interesting. Considering you need a gallon of water to put out every 3 square feet that's on fire, this study showed that actually very minimal amounts of water were needed to support an interior fire attack on the residential structure. So if you look at that red bar, if you want to circle that, Ryan, the highest water usage to extinguish a fire was only 243 gallons.
Right there.
And then if you move on over to that orange bar, that first one, the highest water usage through the entire operation was 489 gallons. So we do carry enough water. What we don't carry is time. And this slide just underscores the importance of the challenge of quickly and easily bringing water to protect life and property.
And then actually, too, real quick with that 243 gallon number, that application, that where they put 243 gallons of water, that was the experiment where they had the missing ceiling. So a lot of that water was because it was wasted because they spent probably close to 30 seconds putting water into the attic space when it wasn't even when the fire compartment was actually below that. So that just goes to show you that ineffective application of water causes you to utilize more water than what you need.
So the bottom line on this study validated our current practices in regard to water supply. So here in Lakeville, we arrive on scene, we have 1,000 gallons in the first engine, 2,700 gallon tanker, and then quickly behind that is another 1,000 gallon engine. So we need to focus on bringing everything we have to bear right away. Generally, the sooner we put enough water on the fire, our problems usually get better. So the rural hitch, that's a good idea. Portable tanks are awesome, but they take time and manpower, so you need to judge the risk versus benefit. Elaborate water supply operations, they're more likely to burn buildings down than to save it in all these scenarios.
So occupant survivability was another very important aspect that they considered in this study. And it really confirmed that victim survivability is related to a multitude of variables. The important thing to understand about this is that none of those variables can be determined from the outside of the building, okay? This whole idea of like survivability profiling and that, okay, I'm going to take a look at this building from the inside of my command vehicle and I'm going to say, okay, yeah, there's nobody can survive in that building. That is complete baloney, and it's completely against everything that we do as firefighters, okay? You cannot tell whether somebody is alive inside the building from the outside of the building. The only way that you can tell is by going inside and doing a search. So the only thing that you really need to be thinking about in your size up as far as victim rescue is, can I occupy this space with a firefighter or not? If the answer is no, then the answer is no. If the answer is yes, then you need to occupy that space with a firefighter or a team of firefighters so you can give any victims that are in there the best chance of survival, okay? Some of the factors that impact victim survivability that they found in this study included proximity to the fire. Obviously, a victim that's closest to the fire is going to be more in danger than someone that's further away, because the person that is closest to where the seat of the fire is going to be subjected not only to more heat, but also more toxic products of combustion as well. Elevation also makes a difference. Persons that are above the fire are going to be in greater danger than people below the fire. So if you have a fire that's on the second floor, a person that is in the we'll say maybe it's a 2.5-story house and you have like a half story above where the seat of the fire is, or maybe there's like an attic bedroom or something like that. They're in more danger than somebody that's on the first floor because the heat and progress and combustion have the tendency to rise, as we all know. But elevation also makes a difference just in general, like even in the area where the fire is. A victim that is on the floor, according to the experiments they did, is more likely to be survivable versus a victim that is, say, on a bed. So even like that difference of like a couple of feet from being on a bed versus being on the floor in that environment can actually make a difference. So we have to consider that when we're searching as well. They consider isolation as an important component of victim occupant survivability. We know that obviously closing doors and controlling flow paths makes a big difference when it comes to survivability. So if we have somebody that's maybe entrapped in the building that they can't get out, if they get into a room and they close the door, that's going to buy them some time to be rescued, right? Because it delays the entrance of progress combustion and heat into that room that they're in. But there's also some evidence, and they didn't really get into it too much with the study because it was a little bit beyond their scope, but there is some evidence that even things like debris or like other types of objects that a person could use to shield themselves can actually make a difference in survivability. So it's not just being able to get into a clean compartment, as you could say. It's also any type of like objects that may be able to cover the victim may actually make a difference in survivability. And then timing also makes a difference too. When we talk about timing, is that they're using kind of the term that we would utilize in like hazmat. So like, what is your timed exposure to the bad stuff, to the products of combustion? But the longer somebody is in the building, the worse off it is for them. And it kind of goes to show you that you could have a victim that may be very remote from the scene of the fire, but if you don't get into that space to search for them and you let that person stay in that environment for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, what have you, even though they may be in a completely different part of the building, they are still being exposed potentially to those that bad stuff, to those the smoke and heat and products of combustion, and that the amount of time that they spend in that building is going to be negative for them. It's going to be it's going to lead to possibly a poor outcome the more time they spend in that building. So the important thing to keep in mind with this is just not get tunnel vision, right? You can have occupants that are remote from the fire room, but they can still be in danger from heat and smoke. That stuff will spread throughout the building, even if it doesn't light that particular area on fire. It's still there, and it still could potentially be a problem for those victims. So we have to make sure that we do a really good search of the building to make sure that the building is clear and to remove any victims that we find right away.
And just another consideration too, in regard, it's not just the smoke and the heat that could affect them as well. It's their own anxiety, and people, even though they may not be in the room directly involved in fire, they can panic.
Right, and that can definitely lead to some bad outcomes for them, because they may end up going into places that we don't want them to go into, or what have you. So psychology definitely plays a big factor into victim survivability as well. So that's definitely a good point. So just kind of wrapping things up here. I mean, I think this was a really interesting study. I think it showed a lot of very interesting perspectives on the idea of coordinated fire attack and ventilation. And I think it really validated not only a lot of the tactics that we're using now, but I just think it's funny that it really validates a lot of the old school firefighting methods that have been around for a long, long time that for some reason we kind of forgot about a little bit. And I think a lot of it has to do too with, and I'm not slamming anybody here or saying anything in a negative light, but the way that sometimes we get taught in the fire academy kind of does us a disservice sometimes, because when you go and you do a live burn in the fire academy, they do this in a burn building with pallets and straw, and they have you get right up on top of the thing, and they have you sit there. No, we're gonna wait a few minutes. We're gonna let it get hotter. We're gonna wait until your partner gets down from humping hose downstairs so that he can see it too, and then we're gonna maybe put the fire out. You know what I mean? And then we're just gonna spray some water on it, and it goes out because it's pallets and straw. And it doesn't give you like a realistic viewpoint of what an actual structure fire is like. It is extremely hot, and it goes from bad to really bad really, really quickly. And a lot of guys and girls don't get trained on how to occupy a space with your fire stream. And I think that that's something that we really need to do a better job of and do more of in our fire training, moving forward. And it's definitely something that I like to do a lot in the training program internal with the department. But I think it's really, really important because it's not just a matter of getting to the room and putting the fire out. It's if you're in a serious fire where you're in a post-flashover state, you have to fight your way there. And if you don't, you have a real potential that you could get yourself in a bad situation if you don't open up that water, that line and flow water. But that's something that guys, back in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s knew, and then we kind of just got away from it for whatever reason. And to me, looking at the study and seeing all the scientific validation of stuff, it's showing me the applicability of tactics that I learned from old school firefighters, like the firefighters from Fall River that taught me in the Air Fire Academy, and people like my father and Snooky Roberts, and some of these guys that have been around for a long, long time. And it just shows that it really does work, and that maybe we should have been listening to them all along. You got anything, Pam? Any wrapping up thoughts?
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting that the study did tend to support the fact that we are returning to our old roots. And the old school way, sometimes they are the best way, but it's also good to keep an open-minded approach and fail to recognize when it's warranted and when it isn't.
Yeah, definitely. I think that even going to things like tanker nursing and the rural hitch operation and everything, and that was so it's such like an old school tactic that worked for so long. I mean, this is going back into the Doug Mills era of firefighting, right? And we got away from it because everybody was beating the drum of portable tanks, portable tanks, portable tanks. Well, portable tanks are great when you have a large volume of fire and you need to be able to support that tanker shuttle to be able to support the volume that you need. But the amount of time that it takes you to set up a really good portable tank operation, you could burn the building down in that time frame versus just hitting the fire with everything that you have. And that's something that, again, that a lot of the folks back in the day knew that, and we kind of just got away from it because the tactics shifted based off of, I think, an incomplete understanding of what was going on in the fire ground. And now we've kind of come back full circle to it again. And I think that's really that's just an interesting thing. And I think it's great to me because we're keeping an open mind on stuff, and we're looking at what really works versus anecdotes. And I think that's a really important thing for the fire service. And I guess it just goes to show you how progressive that we've become and how many improvements that we made going forward.
I think it was great you found this study and brought it to light. Thanks for doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, guys, this is something that Pam and I are planning on doing on a fairly regular basis. We're going to try to see if we can tackle some subjects that are, important and worthwhile and things that we can do kind of in this podcast environment. So some of the stuff that we're thinking about doing going forward, we have a presentation on fire department leadership that we're going to talk about. I know there's been some conversations about maybe doing something with multi-gas meters and gas monitoring, which I think could be really interesting because we can attack that from both an operations standpoint as well as from a medical perspective as well, and we can do that. So certainly if anybody has any suggestions for topics that you'd like us to cover, we can definitely add that to the list, and we'll try to push these out as often as we can. So I appreciate you guys listening, and thanks for your time, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye now.